right, back to do some more work on the catechism and understand a bit more. But I hope again that you always remember to go back to that first question, because the first question really frames the whole thing. You know, it's what our vision of the Christian life is as a Reformed church and as Reformed Christians. God's grace, sin, salvation, service, guilt, grace, gratitude. What's your comfort? I'm not my own. I belong to Christ. He watches over me, and I'm willing now to live fully for God's will and to do what God would have me to do. So that's start. So question number 2 comes to us. What must you know to live and die in the joy of this comfort? And so it stresses this idea that there ought to be some happiness around this. There ought to be some joy in it. And that joy really comes when you take time to think about all that God has given you. You know, we'll come to Christmas each year, and you know, we know it's about the baby in the manger. And but if you take time to unpack that, and you realize that the God who created heaven and earth, and God sets aside the glory, the Son of God sets aside His glory and humbles Himself, becomes one of us, this weak, small child. The more you think about that, the more it's amazing, and the more you get the joy to the world out of it. So what must you know to live and die in the joy of this comfort? So they say 3 things you have to know. First, how great my sin and misery are. Second, how I'm set free from all my sins and misery. And third, how I'm to thank God for such deliverance. And so it starts off with this focus on our sin. Now, sin is one of many words that we use to talk about basically the same thing. That God has a path for us, and we get off it. So in one way or another, at the root of the sin question is this idea that here's where we ought to be, but instead of that, we're somewhere else. We're doing something else, we're thinking something else, we're saying something else. And that's an issue, because the God who created all things desires all things to be in harmony, to be working right, to be fulfilling God's very good will. And so when we get off the track, we're like things rattling around in an engine. We're like having parts in a machine where they don't belong, and then it's going to hurt other things, and the machine's going to blow up. So we are meant to be on track, living out the will of God, but we get off it. And so how do we know this? How do you come, in number 3, how do you come to know your misery? This condition you're in where you're a piece of the engine that's loose and is batting around. How do you come to know your misery? The law of God tells me. So it's very, the law then is what shows us the path of God. So we have to read, when God says something, we read it and say, well, what does God want? What would it look like if it was the way God wanted it to be? So the law of God tells me. And then the next question says, well, what does God's law require of us? What, in a summary, what is it? Because the Bible is a very big book. And so what is a summary? And the answer is, well, Christ teaches this in summary in Matthew 22. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend or hang on these 2 commandments. So anything else there is in the Bible, it's connected in some way to loving God or loving other people. And so those for us as Christians are the root. Jesus said, here's the core of the whole thing. Here's the center of it. Love God, love your neighbor, and anything else fits in there somehow. So, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. So your body is your strength. So is your body showing love for God by doing what God wants done? Your mind, are you working to think about the world in life the way God thinks about the world? Your heart, your soul, your emotions. So it's a whole, all of you. It's not as if the law teaches us here that it's not as if you give God what God wants and then you go on with your life. It's not as if you can say, well, what does God want? Well, God wants $10. So here's $10, God. Now I can go on and do whatever I want to do. God doesn't want what you got. God wants you. God wants your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, all offered in grateful love for God. This connection with God of appreciation, of gratitude and thankfulness, and just your heart knowing the one who gives you your life and who cares deeply about you. So the law says, do you do that? Do you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? And then it says, love your neighbor as yourself. So is there any way in which you've missed that? Is there any way in which you come short of that you're not offering grace, help, and concern and love to your neighbor? And so the next question says, can you live up to all this perfectly? And the answer is no. So let's get this straight, let's get this straight for you. We Christians are not perfect people. Christians don't do everything right. And we don't think we do everything right. And, anybody who thinks they've got it all put together and they do everything that they ought to do is off. Because this says, can you live up to all this perfectly? No. It says that I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. So what is the natural human condition now, we would ask? In this lost and broken world, what is the natural state of people? And the natural state is for people to reject God, to hate other people, to live for themselves, to do harm to others, to reject God's will for their life, and try to get whatever it is that they think they want out of life. And that's a natural state of people from the way we look at it here. So it says, you have not loved God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you have not loved your neighbor as yourself. And so, why is that? Because it's in your nature not to do that. So it says, I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. So this is just how we are. This is how we come into the world. So we don't believe, like some people want to think, that you come into the world all like clean and like a white piece of paper with nothing on it. We believe that you come into the world already broken. And so every little child comes into the world with a natural tendency to be for themselves, to reject God, to not care about others, but to be self-centered and self-interested and self-promoting, the pride issue that we deal with. So I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. And you can see this. You know it in your own life. You know it in other people's lives. We know it in our lives. It's just the way that we are. So the question goes on to say, well, did God create us this way? Is this what God wanted for us? Did God create people this way? No. The answer is God created them good and in His own image, in true righteousness and holiness. that they might truly know God their Creator, love Him with all their heart, and live with Him in eternal happiness for His praise and glory. So that gets us back to the garden story, the account in Genesis of the garden. And the account there, doesn't have to be for you a scientific explanation of exactly how the atoms came together and the things developed in terms of science and physics, but it is true in what it teaches us about who we are, how we fit into the world, and where God is. God is a creator, that God created us, and that God has a will and a plan for us. So in the garden, we see this plan. God creates Adam and Eve and puts them in the garden so that they can enjoy the garden, care for the garden, raise children, have them engaged in caring for this world, and to cultivate all kinds of gifts and discover all kinds of things and explore this world. It would have been a place of joy and beauty and happiness and harmony, people together. God created us good and wanted to walk with us. It even says in the Genesis account that God walks in the garden with people. So God wanted to create us for fellowship, and that we would walk with this God. Now God is a spirit, so God takes on some form or other and is present with Adam, with Eve in the garden, and that shows us what God wants. That's a story that reflects to us, this is what God was intending at the very beginning of creation, that they might know God, love God, and live with God in happiness for His praise and glory. And so it's a very important point for us to work on, that the world that we live in now is not the way God wanted it to be. So God created the world good. God created people good. And we'll talk next time about what went wrong with that. But you want to start out understanding this, that we live in a lost world, we say, in a broken world. That it is, we're broken, we're not where we're supposed to be, the world is a mess, and it doesn't come from God's hand that way. And so it's very important for us to understand this, because the Bible will all be from this point about how God doesn't abandon this broken world, but works to bring it back. And that's the big insight. That's the big story of the Bible. God creates it good, it gets broken, God does something to fix it, bring it back, and one day it'll be right. So that's where we're at. So take time to think about these things, work on the questions that are provided for you, and we'll come back and talk about some of the other questions.